to Ancient History. It's volume 6. It's a lot to get into in this video. We've been going through the Ancient History series and talk about everything that basically been going on since the fall of Kemet, up until now. We have to get into one of the most, hidden parts about our history, and that is the Conquest. We can go back and look at a lot of stuff that happened with the history of America, and we see the triumphs and a lot of the things that the many different countries did during this time. But what is largely hidden, not really so much hidden, just not taught, is what took place. It's a big gap in our history that a lot of people don't follow. What took place once you have the fall of the African kingdoms up until slavery in America as we know it today. It's a lot that happened, not to mention the genocide of African tribes and people all over, the planet. So when we talk about this colonial conquest, this conquest of the Europeans, what does it really all entails? And I don't really think you can find too many places that put it all together. Well, not in video, but books, of course. But it's a history that must be understood, because then people can understand who they are by connecting these dots and why they are where they are at. And that's really speaking to the people of South America and understanding, how you got there and who the indigenous people of these lands really are and what real history is talking about. So we get into this thing and talked about before how we had this whole argument about Africans selling, other Africans into slavery. And I showed you guys, if you are a member of Merkabah Academy, I put the video up there about King Battlebansu, who the Dutch cut his head off because he wouldn't sell out to the Europeans and sell people into slavery. This is what happened. So when people talking about us selling each other into slavery, as I said this before, they don't understand. These kings, these rulers were forced to do so. They were forced to go and hunt down their enemies and enslave them, or risk their own people being enslaved, so on and so forth. You had some people that was willing to do so, others were not, and he wasn't willing to do this, so they cut off his head. And as I talked about in the video, they preserved his head, they pickled his head, preserved it for over 200 years. You have the Netherlands basically returning the head to the people, and they basically have this whole understanding of the history of a man who lost his head to try to save his own people, a history that should be taught and a lot of people should know. But bigger than that, they should have the understanding of this was the pressure that rulers faced when it was faced with the decision of slavery, enslaving their own people or not. But we get into this history. And as I said before, it wasn't about slavery. It wasn't about capturing slaves to have free labor in America. This was about conquest. This was about conquest, one, and hiding every facet of African intelligence, sophistication, accomplishments, and everything that we did back in the ancient world, completely destroying all of that, getting rid of all information, all knowledge of what we did and what we were able to do before the rise of the European powers. And this is what they have effectively done. So let's start with Benin. Talked about Benin and the many hidden accomplishments of African people on YouTube. But it says here, at the end of the 13th century, when the first European travelers encountered the Great Benin City in West Africa, present Nigeria, he wrote, "The town seems to be very great. When you enter it, you go into a great broad street not paved, which seems to be 7 or 8 times broader than the Warmoed Street in Amsterdam. The king's palace is a collection of buildings. There are numerous apartments for the princes, ministers, and fine galleries, most of which are as big as those on the exchange in Amsterdam. The town is composed of 30 main streets, very straight and 120 feet wide. The houses are arranged in good order. These people are in no way inferior to the Dutch as regards cleanliness. They wash and scrub their houses so well that they are polished and shining like a looking glass. But sadly, in 1897, Benin City was destroyed by the British forces under Admiral Harry Rawson. The city was looted, blown up, and burnt to the ground." Now, one of the things you'll see as we go through this, and you'll see if you've been digging through history, they made it a primary objective, a main point, to destroy everything, burn down the cities completely, destroy it, blow up what they could, reduce it to rubble. As I've shown you guys, a lot of the ruins still remain, but to make it as if these people, they had no cities. It wasn't as beautiful and marvelous as we just read, that these people just had nothing and they buried cities. Like, it's so much hidden in Africa that a lot of people don't understand. That's underground, and the people who have the knowledge of it is dead and gone. And we're not going to really know until later, exploration is done about these cities that's buried, because they blew them to pieces and they buried, everything that was left, the remnants, the ruins. They even took the time to do that, to not leave the ruins in certain places. And it's far from them coming in and wanting for slaves to come to America or go to Europe and do, slave labor. It's deeper than that. They wanted to completely hide anything that showed sophistication and education from African people that predates them, which is what, we've seen in Africa. But let's look at this Admiral Sir Harry Holdsworth Rawson. It says, I just want to read here real quick. It says, Admiral Sir Harry Holdsworth Rawson was a senior officer in the Royal Navy. He is chiefly remembered for overseeing the British Benin expedition, and this is how they call it, the expedition, the damn expedition, it's genocide, of 1897 that burned and looted the city of the Kingdom of Benin, now in Nigeria. No shame was attached to the event at the time, which amounted to a punitive expedition, and Rawson was appointed governor of New South Wales, serving from 27 May 1902 to 27 May 1909. So he basically got promoted for what he did. We know the same thing happened with the Ashanti tribe. They went to war with the Europeans and they lost, and had a lot of their cities and their towns and their villages, what have you, burnt and destroyed. But we see this with Harry Rawson. We know about King Leopold and the whole thing with the Congolese people in the Belgian Congo. He killed over 10 million African people. 10 million Africans. He's credited with this, and it's something that that's just known. Over 10 million people. I mean, that's enough people to fill every NFL stadium in America 3 times. And think about that. Every single NFL stadium, you could fill it 3 times. That's how many people this man killed. You also have General Van Trotha, who is responsible for the Namibian people's genocide of the Herero tribe. These people went to war with him from 1904 to 1907, and they lost once, of course, they came with the guns, and it was a complete massacre after that. But we have, 3. We can keep going down the line with this. These European generals we're going to keep seeing coming into African territories, completely destroying the people and walking out of there with gold and what have you and everything else, and keeping it moving. Now, this is before. This is after we get into, a lot of the stuff that was happening with the Sub-Saharan slave trade. This is just like them cleaning up. You had the Sub-Saharan slave trade still going on. And then it was like this big, this big need for slaves for some reason, because they wanted to develop the New World because of the deal they was having that was going on with the people, with the Moors. We're going to get into that. Them understanding what was going on in the Americas. But it was at some point they came together and they had it all set up and laid out to go into these kingdoms, because as I said before, they went into the kingdoms where it was advanced, where they was sophisticated. This is what they destroyed. They didn't really care about the tribal people, which is why they still are allowed to live and survive today, because they're tribal. They're not trying to build major cities or trying to really be leaders in, agriculture or trade or what have you, like these cities was doing. It was leading the world, and everybody was coming from around the world to come trade and learn from the Africans. These were the people who they targeted for destruction, and this is what they was doing. But then we understand what happened with the Tasmanian people. Now, a lot of people don't know that whole story, but you had for a long time, Tasmanian people been around for 40,000 years. And once the flood happened, it was a flood that basically brought a lot of sickness to the Tasmanian people, and their numbers started to decline. The numbers started to go down. And the land it was on, the island of Tasmania, they wanted the land, of course. They came in there, they've been trying to get it for a long time, and they was wiping the people out before they admit. But you had, in 1833, George Augustus Robinson, who was sponsored by Lieutenant Governor George Arthur. So George Robinson seen that, the Tasmanian people numbers basically went down to like 200. And they wanted the land so bad they didn't want to wait till these 200 people died or try to kill the last remaining 200 people. So he basically got funding. And he took the 200 people from Tasmanian Island to northeast of Tasmanian Island to a small island called Flanders Island or something like that, Flinders Island. And about 14 years later, from 200 Tasmanian people, it was like 47 left. Then 45 of those people died, and it was 2 left that they transferred to Oyster Island, where they later died. So you had the complete genocide. These people wiped out so that they can take the island of Tasmania from these people. Now, the reason why they agreed to basically follow, this general was because he was a preacher. He was a religious person. It was somebody who they knew, they was familiar with, that they let come in. And once people started dying off, they didn't really understand. It probably was, chemical warfare, or they released some kind of, sickness onto the people, and they started dying off. It's the same thing if we go back and look at what happened with the Herero people and the Ashanti, who they basically, they didn't want white people in there. And they were still naive about it because you had white people coming in who was peaceful and was helping out and was teaching, but they didn't realize that they was, infiltrators. They was there to basically get the lay of the land and understand the people, so later these generals can come in. And this is one of the reasons why I've always been against religion. This is how they came into a lot of these tribes first. They came in peaceful, bringing food, trading with these people, being, really nice, but really doing reconnaissance and getting the understanding of who was what and what was going on. So later these generals can come in and take over. But even still, you had people from these tribes say, any white people come in, they're going to kill them, except for, the missionaries and so on and so forth, because they didn't understand that these people was bad as well. And they was just there to infiltrate. So we have this. We had to have this going on. You have to understand this. You're going to find this a lot. You have these different tribes, different parts of Africa. They coming in there, killing them off, moving on. This is colonization. This is genocide that we're seeing here. Now we understand that this was going on in Africa, but a lot of people don't understand what was taking place in South America. And this is one of the questions I get from a lot of my Latino followers, a lot of my people that's from the Caribbean, a lot of my Mexican people that's been following me. They've been wanting to know about this history and what took place. And it's a lot of information out there about this, but this is what you got to understand. One, you had the whole genocide of these Africans and what was going on in Africa. But we also understand about Columbus, Ponce de Leon, and the whole genocide of the Taino people or the Taino people down in the Caribbean. So we're talking about the Taino people, which would be the people of the Caribbean. We're talking about Jamaicans, we're talking about Puerto Ricans, we're talking about Portuguese-speaking people in Brazil, the Bahamas, Dominican Republic, so on and so forth. So the Taino people, and you had Columbus coming there, and everybody know about this whole story, what Columbus did. Columbus was brutal. He was sick. They raped the people. They had no mercy on these people. It got bad. It got so bad that people was committing suicide because of how bad they was killing people. They was taking people by the 13s and hanging them, saying that it was because of to pay tribute to Jesus and the 12 apostles, or Jesus and the 12 disciples, or what have you. So they were sicking dogs, having dogs chase people down and rip them to shreds, killing babies, killing men, women, and children, hanging them. They just had no remorse for nobody. They killed millions of people. They killed half the population, upon arrival. Once they got there, the first few months they was there, to kill half the population of the Taino people. It got so bad to where they had to bring Africans in, other people from Africa, to basically handle trade and basically, do the labor there. The people that was left, They put them through hard labor. They was raping the women, spreading diseases and sickness, and teaching Christianity at the same time, believe it or not. So, it was rough. It was crazy there. It was one of the hardest times that we see on record, besides what was going on in Africa, that these people had to endure, for a long time. So there has been this whole debate and this whole question of who is the indigenous people of the Caribbean. It would be the Taino people. But, for my, Puerto Rican, Dominican, my Latin American people who's been following, this is what you got to understand. If you are of mixed race, you are not indigenous to anywhere. It's just that simple. And that's tough for people to understand, but you are not indigenous to anywhere if you are of mixed race. Because the two races that brought you into existence had to exist before you. It's common sense. But you got to go back and look at the history as to how you got in a particular locale in the world, and it had to do with really the conquest of the Europeans when you begin to understand. Most people think that the race has been around for forever, since the beginning. A lot of people don't understand the history, so don't understand how they came about. A lot of people just believe, we've been here, Puerto Ricans been here, Dominicans, we just always been here, and this has always been our land, since the beginning. They don't understand that history. But you got to understand, it's only one race. It's just one. If you're not of African descent, then you are of mixed race. White people are a mutation of African people. So now, I talked about this before. It's going to be hard for some people who didn't see to understand that. But check out this video real quick.
Soon after, this identical genetic mutation was found in fair-skinned Europeans.
There was a magic moment in this research. When I got back the results that showed that the number and the size and the amount of pigment in the light-skinned zebrafish were all diminished, and the same thing happened in humans. When I opened the textbook and saw that same thing, I began to sweat. Not only did light-skinned people evolve from black-skinned people, but lighter-skinned people, whether they're European or whether they're Asian, like me, were actually mutants of the dark-skinned people.
This was remarkable because we had only inferred on the basis of circumstantial evidence that this must have occurred in evolution, but we didn't have any concrete genetic evidence. Now we do.
And so, what did you find?
We did not see any, even one single individual that could be considered as the descendants of the Homo erectus in China. Rather, everybody was a descendant of our ancestors from Africa.
The result couldn't have been any clearer. So how did that make you feel as a Chinese person?
After I saw the evidences that we generate in my laboratory, I think we should all be happy with that, because after all, modern humans from different part of the world are not so different from each other, and we are very close relatives.
It's great, isn't it?
The earliest members of our lineage, the genus Homo, were darkly pigmented, and we all share this incredible heritage of having originally been darkly pigmented. The melanin served as a superb natural sunscreen. These lineages of people dispersing into the northern hemisphere lost their pigmentation.
So the indigenous people that's in China comes from the San people of South Africa. Plain and simple, you take a look at them, you can see this is where Asians come from. And as you've seen in the video, this is what they came to the conclusion of. This is well known and widely known across the world. It is unchallenged research because you can't dispute actual DNA genetic fact and proof, which is why Dr. Keith Chang in the first video has gone unchallenged, as well as the other gentlemen as well, because they proved it. And it makes sense anyway. You can look around and see, one, no white, Puerto Rican, whatever person can produce a black person. Just that simple. But we can go look in Africa and we can find black people with blonde hair and blue eyes. We can see black people have white people, albino babies with blonde hair, white skin. You can only see that coming from African people. You can't see that vice versa nowhere. There's nowhere on this planet where you've seen a white person turning black or their skin turning black. You've seen with vitiligo where you have a black person with white skin, and that can completely keep going until their skin is completely white. And talked about that in plenty of videos before. So that's clear to understand. It's not an ego thing. It's not a bragging thing. It's just genetic fact. The original people are African people. It's just that simple. So the indigenous people who already been here and populated the entire planet and it was all over was already African people. We can go back and look at the artifacts. We can look at the Olmec heads that predates Columbus by, a long time. These people have already been here, have already established themselves on the planet before the conquest of the Europeans. And as I talked about in Meditation Part 3, about how you had this connection of spiritual people. Everybody was in this spiritual togetherness, following the same things until the Europeans came and destroyed that, because they were the only group of people that didn't have civilizations back in ancient times that was following this whole, spiritual following that, the ancient Egyptians and the people down in Mesoamerica and ancient Asia and so on and so forth was following the same teachings that the ancient Egyptians was pointing out, except for the Europeans. So this is one of the reasons why they did what they did with Conquest. So as I said, you had Columbus come in, kill millions of people, so much so that they had to bring over Africans to South America to basically, help with the workload. But as I said, the people that were already there was already black, who came from Africa thousands of years prior. So a lot of people was wiped out. But you got to understand, Christopher Columbus is Italian. He's an Italian man. He was there for the Spanish crown. The Spanish crown that was basically held by Ferdinand and Isabella during that time. Now, Ferdinand and Isabella was under the rule of Rome. Rome was ruling Spain during this time, which is why Columbus, being Italian from Rome, why he was appointed to task, but he was basically following the orders of Rome, which basically gave those orders to Ferdinand and Isabella on the Spanish throne. So, understand, Spain was, pushing out Columbus and sending him on so many different expeditions. And this is what he was doing. Rome had already basically took over Spain from the Moors and colonized it. I was just there, last year, I think it was, year before last, where, as I said, you look at the people in Spain today, they're white people. They white. Just look at them. They white. They look like regular white people because their descendants came from Italy. You go to Spain, nothing but white people. Go to Portugal, basically the same thing. It's because Rome took over back then, colonized the place, and they exist there to this day. So, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico. If you're from Dominican Republic, you're from Puerto Rico, what language do you speak? You speak Spanish. Same thing over in Brazil. If you're in Brazil, what language do they speak in Brazil? They speak Portuguese. So you have Portugal going back to Spain. You have Spain, the people from Dominican Republic, from Puerto Rico, speaking Spanish. It's from Spain. And a lot of people, I know there's a simple connection, but a lot of people have not made that connection. You got to understand the old, because they call Puerto Ricans, they call Latin American people Hispanics. If you're in America, they call you Hispanic. It's on the job application. But what the Romans called Spain back in the day was Hispania. That's what it was known as. So this is where you get this language from. It comes from the Romans. Now understand this. Spanish as well as Portuguese are both Romanist languages, meaning they came from Rome. So you got to understand, what you are and what your descendants are and where they come from. Go look in South America. Look in Panama. Go look in Brazil. Go look in Argentina. Go look in a lot of these places and you'll see the whiteness there. Plain and simple. White as day. Same thing with Puerto Rico. You got a lot of Puerto Ricans that can pass for white folks because they're mixed. And that's the thing they don't really understand. You have a lot of Puerto Ricans that basically will not admit that they have any kind of black or African blood within them. But during this slavery, during this whole time of conquest, after they done raped and pillaged and destroyed and rebuilt the land for their people, they brought over their people. Plain and simple. Same thing they did in North Africa, as I talked about before. Once they come in and take over the land, they bring their people in to build and basically, colonize the place. And this is what happened in Puerto Rico. It's what happened in Dominican Republic. It's what happened down in Brazil, Latin America. You had these people from Spain who was already speaking Spanish, which is a Romanist language that developed over time. come over there and later on would mix in with the indigenous people there, or some of the indigenous people there that was, African or, Caribbean or whatever you want to call them, mixed in later on with a lot of them. And you just have a lot of mixture that went on there. But basically, it's either you are from Rome, your ancestors, or you are a mixture of the indigenous people or the people that was there during that time and somebody from Rome. So you be half white. This is one of the reasons why I don't really get upset when I hear a lot of Puerto Ricans and Dominican peoples don't claim to be half black or mixed with black, because it's a possibility that they're not. But it's something I expect somebody, white to say anyway. I wouldn't want to be associated with African people if I thought there was something wrong with them. But you have been taught to think there's something wrong with African people, and that it's some reason not popular to be black, because of how we are being displayed and portrayed in the media, what have you. But, this is the history of how these people came about and how they got in these particular parts, of the world, in the Caribbean. But again, you got to look at the whole migration pattern. We had Africans travel all the way over from Africa all the way over to Australia. You also have the current that takes you from South Africa straight into South America. So you had the Aboriginal people coming over from Australia, coming over from Africa, who basically sailed to South America and began to populate there. And as you had the whole land bridge, there's a whole ice bridge that was basically blocking the pathway from north of America, Canada, and Alaska, what have you. Once you had that melt, you had a lot of these so-called Mongoloid people start to come in and mix in with these indigenous people from Africa that sailed over from Australia, what have you. And that's what basically give you some of the earliest people that mixed later on. But understand, before that even happened, you already had African people there. So this occurred. But you have many people that believe that the original people are basically gone, that the Spanish wiped them out, that they extinct. A lot of people believe that, they killed so many of them that it's very small chance that any of the originals are left, or any of those bloodlines are left. But it says here, firstly, I am somewhat disappointed that the editor failed to discuss or debate the controversial and outdated hypothesis of Irving Roos regarding the conquest of island-dwelling Arawaks by cannibalistic Caribs migrating north from South America. The ethnic distinction between Taino and Caribs is problematic at best, and the Carib cannibal myth has been thoroughly debunked in recent literature, especially by writers such as Whitehead and Hall. This should have been addressed in a serious volume of this scope. Secondly, the existence of indigenous people in the Caribbean into the new millennium continues to challenge popular writing and standard scholarship. Entrenched is the idea that the Taino became extinct within the first generation of European contact, and that between 1620 to 1660, this wave of conquest reduced indigenous control in the archipelago to parts of the island of Dominica and St. Vincent. But Caribs and Arawaks did survive outside these areas of indigenous political control, yet it rarely acknowledged. How often does one see reference to the fact that there is only one official preserve for the indigenous island Caribs, and that is on Dominica? The St. Vicentian Black Carib or Huerfano population had been relocated by the British to Honduras in the 1790s at roughly the same time as the British also expelled thousands of Jamaican Maroons to Nova Scotia. It might therefore come as a surprise to some to learn of the many new Taino organizations which have appeared as if out of nowhere in recent years in Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic, or when one discovers that island Carib life is being celebrated on a regular basis in Trinidad and Tobago at the annual Santa Rosa Festival. Yet in 1989, Cultural Survival reported a population of over 1,000 descendants of the Taino, referred to as Cubanos by Bartolomé de las Casas in the 1500s, living in the far east of that island in the vicinity of Baracoa. For various reasons, the existence of an Indian population in Cuba has been vehemently denied by both government sources and academics for most of this century, and the belief persists that they were exterminated by 1550. In the view of much Cubans, such people cease to be Indians if they intermix with Africans or Europeans, or if they exhibit any Western affections. And this is one of the things that you can look at the ignorance of a lot of people who don't understand. If you're talking about mixing in with white or mixing in with black, then what do you think you are? Because there's no other people other than black and white. If you're not black, if you're not white, which white is a mutation, as I showed you, of black people, then you are a mixture, plain and simple. You are a mixture of the two, or you're a mixture of something else. So you have the Mongoloid people, you have the people down at the Sand people in South Africa, which would give us the Asians, which they look that way. But you also have Africans, which is where these people come from. And then you have the mutated white people, the Aryans or what have you. You are a mix of the three, plain and simple. You're a mix. So moving to different parts of the land and staying in different parts of the world, I should say, causes different types of appearances, as we can see. The colder it gets, the lighter your skin gets. If you don't need as much melanin as you would need in Africa, the lack of melanin will cause straight hair. We went through this whole thing in a couple of my previous videos. So this is what we see. It's one of the reasons why you can go in certain places, and don't get me wrong, you can go in Africa and you can find every hair type. We have straight hair, we have curly hair, we have black, we have blonde, we have all different hair types. In Africa, all different eye colors, you can find it all there. And that's one of the hardest things for people to accept when you start talking about this kind of information. And, I heard a lot of people just really disagree with the fact that Africans was here before anybody else, that we are the original people. A lot of people don't want to believe that because of the present state that we see African people in. But, if you watch my videos, you understand why. You understand how that whole thing came about. I was telling you guys before about arguing with a person in Morocco who didn't understand that Africans was in Morocco long before he was. And this dude was clearly mixed white. And it's the same thing I hear from people from Latin America, people from Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, who are light. A lot of people don't like the idea of being mixed with white, but it's how you came about. It's a fact. And it's to be in opposition to us as well, and to basically have a part of anything to really do with keeping black people oppressed, or keeping us feeling like we are the lowest of the low as far as genetics on the planet. But you see how, the lighter the skin, the better the treatment is. And at all costs, if you're dark, you don't really get the benefit of the doubt from this system. But, definitely take a look at this and understand that the history has been proven and it's real. Take a look.
What science has now found, although this is suppressed for the most part, this is not taught in your public schools, although it will be. The history that the children are learning today is not going to be history that's going to be taught in the next 25 years. It's going to be radically different. We now know for a fact that long before Columbus, there were 4 major migrations of blacks to the Americas, different parts of the Americas. And it is now known that the West African Kingdom of Mali had huge fleets of merchant vessels, and that these kings, these black kings of West Africa, began sailing across the Atlantic to Mexico as early as 900 AD, about 200 years before Christ, up until right at about the time of Christ. In other words, about 2,000 years ago. There now appears that there were wealthy West African and North African blacks, and came, if you can believe this or not, but there is solid proof for it now, to southern Illinois. Now I'll explain how that happened. In 1982, our time, there was a guy who was going along southern Illinois. He was a cave hunter. And he was, I don't know if you're familiar with southern Illinois at all, on the Ohio River, it's just honeycombed with caves, thousands of caves. They have not all been explored by any means. And he was involved in sports for hunting in caves. It's done all the time. It's rough work. Sometimes these caves are very narrow. He went into, to make a long story short, he went into this cave that had no one never seen before. And he squeezed through a very narrow entrance, and all of a sudden it turned out into an enormous room. And in this room, he found great sarcophagi, or coffins, coffin lids, made out of stone. The walls are engraved with all kinds of stories, picture stories of men and women in old costumes from the ancient world. And then on the floor he found stacks of thousands upon thousands of these black rocks that were beautifully engraved with the profiles of people, not Indians, but hundreds are of black people, all in profile. They are made on a type of rock that is found really mostly only in southern Illinois in caves. This rock is like a clay. You pull it out of the ground and you have like a stylus or a pen, and you can draw on it real fast. You can draw profiles and letters, and then as it dries it turns into a hard rock. And these rocks are piled up on the floor of this cave. Now this man's name is Russell Burroughs. He's not an archaeologist, he's just a spelunker, he's a cave enthusiast. He brought these out over time. They're very difficult to bring out because the cave entrance is so narrow. And he's brought out now almost 10,000 of these magnificent tablets. They're very crude looking as rocks are concerned, but the drawings are beautiful. And they show the profiles of black people, some with scarification, which is West African, mostly with not that, some with specifically West African robes, which are still used today. Some of them will show like a black man with a kind of a sailor's cap, and in the background will show like a ship or a fish. It seems as though they're portraying a captain or a sailor of some kind. In 1861, a farmer was plowing his field, came across a very strange domed rock, a black rock, and he couldn't dig it out. The more he dug down, the bigger this rock got, until he dug the entire thing away. It took him weeks to dig it away. And it turned out that he unearthed a 9-foot-high statue of a head, beautifully done, of an African, not an Indian at all the portrayed features of a West African man. This is one of the great Olmec heads, and this is part of this helmet, this marvelous helmet, which nobody could understand. There's no other parallel for this helmet found anywhere in the world except West Africa.
South American archaeologists are finding unusual human remains. The skulls aren't European, but they aren't American Indian either. The skulls aren't European, but they aren't American Indian either. They belong to none of the prehistoric races known to have set foot in the New World. These skulls are as old as the Ice Age. So who were these first people to discover the Americas? And what became of them? Did they all disappear? Or did some of them survive? Archaeologists there have recently unearthed human remains. Prehistoric skulls were found buried in layers of soil 9,000 to 12,000 years old. They are the oldest skulls in the Americas. And this is the oldest of them all. The skull of a young woman nicknamed Luthia by scientists. Can she tell us who the first Americans were? Walter Neves is a physical anthropologist at Sao Paulo University in Brazil. He's been using a standard and reliable archaeological measure, the shape of the skull, to find out what race she belonged to. He fully expected Luthia to be a Mongoloid, an ancestor of the American Indians.
901.
But then he fed the measurements into the computer.
When we start running the computer and seeing the results, it was amazing because we realized that the statistics, the quantitative analysis we were doing was not showing just people to be Mongoloid. In fact, the analysis was showing just people was anything except Mongoloid.
So who was Luthia? And where did she come from? To find out, the skull was taken to a hospital in Rio de Janeiro to begin the process of reconstructing her face. The cast was then given to Richard Neve of the University of Manchester in England, one of the world's leading forensic artists, to recreate her features.
That, to me, is a Negroid face that has all the features that you associate with a Negroid face. The proportions of the face, it doesn't say anything about it being a Mongoloid.
Her reconstruction is confirmed by measurements Walter Nevis has taken of all his skulls.
The first reaction was not to believe in it. But as the results, repeated so many times, and the result is exactly the same thing. They are very similar to nowadays Aborigines and Africans, and no similarity at all with Mongoloids in Asia or with American Indians. They are very similar to nowadays Aborigines and Africans, and no similarity at all with Mongoloids in Asia or with American Indians.
Now you would think that, all these black people being enslaved, all of this, destruction, what Columbus was doing to these people, what they were doing to the people in Africa, you would think no black person could have dared, free or what have you, could have dared join these men or, took part in what was going on. But they did, There were people that were black. That was with Columbus, that was with Ponce de Leon, and that aided in the massacre of a lot of these people down in South America and the Caribbean. And a lot of people know who these people are, but let's read here.